The smell of burnt coffee and regret hung heavy in the air of Maple Street Diner. It was the kind of place where dreams went to die slowly, one double shift at a time. The red vinyl booths were cracked like broken promises, and the fluorescent lights buzzed with the same tired energy as the waitresses who moved beneath them. For Sarah Chen, this wasn't just a job, it was survival. At 24, she carried the weight of her family's future on shoulders that ached from lifting trays and hearts that had been broken too many times by the casual cruelty of strangers. But what happened on that ordinary Tuesday morning wasn't just cruel. It was something that would expose the true character of two very different people. One would fall from grace so spectacularly that it would make headlines across the nation. The other would rise from humiliation to become a symbol of dignity that millions would remember forever. This is the story of how 30 seconds of recorded cruelty became a lesson that changed everything. Sarah had been working at Maple Street Diner for 3 years, ever since she dropped out of nursing school to help support her younger brother through his cancer treatments. The medical bills had piled up like autumn leaves, suffocating and endless. Every tip mattered. Every smile she forced through exhaustion was currency in the brutal economy of service work. She'd learned to read customers in the first 30 seconds. The way they held their menu, the tone they used to order coffee, whether they made eye contact. It was a survival skill she'd mastered out of necessity. That Tuesday started like any other. The morning rush was a symphony of clattering plates and shouted orders. Construction workers grabbed quick breakfast before heading to job sites. Office workers nursed hangovers with black coffee and quiet desperation. Sarah moved through it all with practiced grace, refilling cups and taking orders with the kind of efficiency that comes from doing something 1,000 times before. Then he walked in. Marcus Wellington wasn't just wealthy. He was generationally rich. The kind of man whose great-grandfather had built railroads while other people's great-grandfathers built the tracks. At 42, he commanded Pinnacle Industries, a sprawling empire of real estate and technology that had made him one of the youngest billionaires in the country. His suit cost more than Sarah made in 6 months. His watch could have paid her brother's medical bills for a year. But wealth, as Sarah was about to learn, doesn't always come with wisdom. And power doesn't guarantee character. Marcus had chosen Maple Street Diner deliberately, not because he enjoyed slumming it with the common people, but because he was meeting someone he wanted to intimidate. David Kim was a small business owner whose family restaurant sat on a piece of prime real estate that Marcus desperately wanted. The meeting was meant to be the final nail in a hostile takeover that had been months in the making. When Marcus slid into the corner booth, his presence immediately shifted the energy of the room. Other customers glanced over, recognizing something predatory in his perfectly groomed appearance. Sarah approached with her usual professional smile, notepad ready. "Good morning. What can I get started for you today?" Marcus didn't look up from his phone. He was scrolling through emails, his attention completely absorbed by the digital world that defined his existence. The silence stretched awkwardly as Sarah waited, her smile beginning to feel heavy on her face. "Sir?" She tried again, her voice gentle but persistent. This time Marcus looked up, but not at Sarah. His eyes swept the diner with undisguised disdain, taking in the worn linoleum floors and the handwritten specials board. When his gaze finally landed on Sarah, it was with the kind of assessment a person might give to a piece of furniture they were considering throwing away. Coffee, black, and make it decent coffee, not whatever swill you usually serve in a place like this. Sarah's smile flickered but held. She'd dealt with difficult customers before. Rich ones, poor ones, and everything in between. Rudeness was just another occupational hazard, like burns from the coffee pot or aching feet from standing all day. "Of course, sir. Our coffee is freshly brewed. Would you like to see a menu while I get that for you?" Marcus waved her away dismissively. I'm not eating anything that comes out of this kitchen. Just bring the coffee and try not to spill it." As Sarah turned to get his order, she heard him mutter under his breath, just loud enough for her to catch, "Unbelievable." This is what passes for service these days. The coffee she brought him was the same blend they'd been serving for 20 years. It wasn't gourmet, but it was hot, fresh, and strong. Sarah set the cup down carefully, along with a small pitcher of cream and some sugar packets, even though he'd ordered it black. It was a small gesture of hospitality, the kind of attention to detail that separated good servers from mediocre ones. Marcus took a sip and immediately made a face like he'd tasted poison. "This is terrible," he announced loud enough for half the diner to hear. "How do you people even stay in business serving garbage like this?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice level. "I'm sorry you don't like it, sir. Would you prefer tea instead? Or perhaps I could make a fresh pot. A fresh pot of the same terrible coffee?" Marcus's voice was rising now, drawing stares from other customers. "What's the point of that? Do you people even understand what quality means, or is this the best you can do?" The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She'd dealt with complaints before, but there was something particularly cruel in the way Marcus was speaking to her. It wasn't just criticism. It was contempt, pure and undiluted. He was looking at her like she was something he'd scrape off his shoe, but Sarah had learned something important during her 3 years at the diner. Dignity wasn't something someone could take from you. It was something you either chose to keep or chose to give away. And she wasn't about to give hers away to a man in an expensive suit who'd never worked a day of honest labor in his life. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside, "I understand you're not satisfied with the coffee. I'd be happy to comp it and get you something else, or if you'd prefer, you're welcome to try the cafe down the street. I'm sure they'd be glad to serve you." The offer was made with perfect professionalism, but Marcus heard something else in it. He heard a backbone. He heard a young woman who wasn't going to grovel for his approval. And for a man accustomed to having the entire world bend to his will, that kind of quiet resistance was infuriating. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms. It would be analyzed by psychologists, debated by ethicists, and remembered as a perfect example of how power without character becomes poison. Marcus stood up from his booth, his full height towering over Sarah's smaller frame. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. "Listen carefully," he said, his words cutting through the diner's ambient noise like a blade. "I didn't come to this pathetic little establishment to be lectured by someone whose greatest achievement in life is carrying plates. You want to know what's wrong with this coffee? It's made by people who don't understand excellence. It's served by people who've never aspired to anything better than this." He gestured around the diner with disgust. "Look at this place. Look at yourself. You're exactly where you belong, serving mediocre coffee to mediocre people in a mediocre life. Don't pretend you have standards when your entire existence is a testament to settling for less." The diner had gone completely silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The cook paused in his work. Even the coffee machine seemed to quiet its burbling protest. Everyone was staring at this well-dressed man systematically destroying a young woman's dignity in front of a room full of strangers. But if Marcus expected Sarah to crumble, he was about to learn something about the steel that gets forged in the fires of real hardship. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't even raise her voice. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes with a calm that was more devastating than any scream could have been. "You're absolutely right, sir," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "I am exactly where I belong. I belong here, working an honest job to support my family. I belong here, treating people with respect regardless of how much money they have. And I belong here, serving customers who understand that being wealthy doesn't give you the right to be cruel. She paused, letting her words settle in the absolute silence of the room. Your coffee is on the house today. Not because you deserve it, but because that's the kind of place this is. We believe in taking care of people even when they forget how to take care of others. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at Sarah, his face flushing red with a combination of rage and something that might have been shame. He'd expected her to break. Instead, she just demonstrated more grace under pressure than he'd shown in his entire privileged life. But the story was far from over. In fact, what happened next would transform both of their lives in ways neither of them could possibly imagine. What Marcus didn't know was that in the age of smartphones, humiliation rarely stays private. 3 tables away, Jennifer Martinez, a local community college student working on her sociology paper about workplace dynamics, had been recording the entire exchange. She'd started filming when Marcus first raised his voice, initially planning to document what she thought would be a typical customer complaint. Instead, she'd captured something far more significant. The video showed everything. Marcus towering over Sarah, his voice dripping with condescension. His cruel assessment of her life and worth. And most powerfully, Sarah's response delivered with a dignity that made everyone in that room sit a little straighter in their chairs. Jennifer's hands were shaking as she stopped recording, knowing she'd just witnessed something extraordinary. Within an hour of posting the video to her social media accounts with the caption, "This is what grace looks like," it had been shared 50 times. Within 6 hours, it had reached 10,000 views. By the end of that Tuesday, the video had exploded across every major platform. The hashtag Maple Street Dignity was trending nationwide. But virality is a double-edged sword, and Marcus Wellington was about to discover just how sharp both edges could be. The first call came at 7 in the morning on Wednesday. Marcus was in his penthouse office, reviewing quarterly reports over his usual breakfast of imported coffee and fresh fruit, when his assistant Patricia burst through the doors without knocking. In 15 years of working for him, she'd never done that. "Mr. Wellington, we have a problem, a big problem." She thrust her tablet toward him, and Marcus found himself staring at his own face, frozen in mid-sneer. The video had been viewed over 2 million times overnight. The comment section was a tsunami of outrage. But it was the shares that told the real story. News outlets were picking it up. Television morning shows were discussing it. His company's stock price was already dropping in pre-market trading. "Sir," Patricia said, her voice tight with professional concern, "your phone has been ringing non-stop. Every major news network wants a statement. The board is requesting an emergency meeting, and..." She paused, clearly dreading what came next. "Your mother called." Marcus's blood ran cold. Eleanor Wellington didn't just call. She summoned. She commanded. She wielded disappointment like a surgeon's scalpel, precise and devastating. If his mother was calling, it meant the family name was at stake. And nothing, absolutely nothing, mattered more to Eleanor Wellington than the family's reputation. The next few hours passed in a blur of damage control that felt more like damage acceleration. Every statement his public relations team crafted made things worse. Their first attempt called the incident a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. The internet responded by sharing the video even more widely, pointing out that Marcus's words were quite clear and required no interpretation. Their second try suggested that Marcus had been under stress and didn't represent his true character. Social media users responded by digging up every public appearance he'd ever made, creating compilation videos of other moments where his arrogance had shown through. Turns out, when you've spent your entire life treating people as beneath you, there's usually evidence. By noon Wednesday, Pinnacle Industries stock had dropped 12%. 3 major clients had put their contracts under review. The company's carefully cultivated image as a progressive, employee-focused organization was crumbling in real time. Board members were no longer requesting a meeting. They were demanding Marcus's resignation, but the real devastation was still coming. At 2 in the afternoon, Marcus's phone rang with a number he recognized but hadn't seen in months. David Kim, the restaurant owner he'd planned to intimidate at the diner, was calling. "Mr. Wellington," David's voice was calm but firm. "I think we both know why I'm calling." Marcus's throat felt dry. The hostile takeover of David's property had been his pet project for months. It was supposed to be the centerpiece of a new development that would generate hundreds of millions in revenue. "David, I hope you understand that what happened yesterday has nothing to do with our business arrangement." David's laugh was soft and sad. "Actually, Marcus, it has everything to do with it. You see, I've been wrestling with whether to sell my family's restaurant for months. It's been in our family for 3 generations. My grandmother started it with nothing but determination and a dream of serving good food to good people." Marcus could feel where this was heading, but he was powerless to stop it. "Yesterday, I watched a video of a man who thinks money gives him the right to crush other people's dignity. I watched him try to destroy a young woman who was just doing her job with grace and professionalism. And I realized something important." David paused, and Marcus could hear the weight of decision in his silence. "I could never sell my grandmother's legacy to someone who would treat it, or the people who work there, with such contempt. The deal is off, Marcus. Permanently, the line went dead, taking with it not just a major business deal, but Marcus's reputation as someone who could close any negotiation." Word of David's withdrawal spread quickly through the business community. Other deals began to unravel. Partners started asking uncomfortable questions about the kind of man they were doing business with. Meanwhile, at Maple Street Diner, something beautiful was happening. The video had brought national attention to the small restaurant, but instead of tourists seeking spectacle, they found something genuine. People came to experience the kind of authentic hospitality that Sarah had shown under pressure. They came to support a business that clearly valued its employees' dignity. Sarah herself had become a reluctant symbol of grace under fire. Interview requests poured in from major networks. Talk show producers wanted her story. A book agent called, offering a substantial advance for her memoir. But Sarah, true to character, declined most of the attention. She had work to do, a brother to support, and a life to live that didn't require validation from strangers. The one interview she did accept was with a local news station, and her words during that brief conversation would be quoted for years afterward. "I don't think what I did was special. I just refuse to let someone else's cruelty change who I am." Dignity isn't about what other people give you. It's about what you refuse to give away. But Marcus Wellington was learning that in the court of public opinion, there's rarely such a thing as redemption without genuine transformation. And transformation, as he was about to discover, required something he'd never had to develop in his privileged life: the courage to face the truth about himself. Thursday morning brought the call he'd been dreading most. Eleanor Wellington's voice carried the chill of generational disappointment when she finally reached her son. "Marcus," she said, her words precise as ice picks, "we need to talk." The Wellington family estate sat like a fortress of old money on 30 acres of manicured perfection in the Hamptons. Eleanor Wellington had built her life around the principle that reputation was the only currency that truly mattered, and she protected it with the ruthless efficiency of a general defending her homeland. At 73, she still commanded board meetings, charity galas, and family crises with the same iron will that had turned her husband's modest inheritance into a dynasty. When Marcus arrived at the estate Thursday evening, he found his mother waiting in the library, surrounded by leather-bound books that had been purchased by the yard for their aesthetic value rather than their content. She didn't look up from the newspaper spread across her mahogany desk, but he could see the headline from across the room. "Billionaire's Diner. Meltdown sparks national conversation about wealth and character." "Sit down, Marcus." Her voice carried the weight of generations of disappointment. Marcus had faced hostile takeover battles, SEC investigations, and congressional hearings with more confidence than he felt walking across his mother's library. He settled into the chair across from her desk, feeling like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. Eleanor finally looked up, her steel-gray eyes reflecting none of the warmth a son might hope to find in his mother's gaze. 42 years old, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 42 years I've watched you grow into exactly the kind of man I prayed you wouldn't become. The words hit harder than any public condemnation he'd faced. Marcus opened his mouth to defend himself, but Eleanor held up a perfectly manicured hand. I've spent the last 2 days fielding calls from every social circle we've ever moved in. The Patterson charity luncheon was canceled rather than risk association with our family name. The Metropolitan Museum is reconsidering our wing dedication. 3 generations of careful reputation building, Marcus, and you've managed to destroy it in 30 seconds of recorded footage. She stood and walked to the window overlooking the estate's rose garden. But do you know what bothers me most? It's not the business losses or the social embarrassment. It's that I raised a son who could look at a young woman working an honest job and see something to destroy rather than something to respect. Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. His mother's disappointment was a weight he'd carried his entire life, always trying to prove himself worthy of the Wellington name. Now he was learning that he'd failed in the most fundamental way possible. Mother, Your father, Eleanor continued, her voice softer now but no less cutting, built this family's wealth by understanding that true power comes from lifting people up, not tearing them down. He started with nothing, Marcus, nothing. He understood what it meant to work with your hands, to earn respect rather than demand it. She turned back to face him, and for the first time in years, Marcus saw his mother not as the formidable matriarch, but as an aging woman watching her legacy crumble. I'm removing you from the Wellington Foundation Board, she said with quiet finality. I'm also restructuring your trust fund. The bulk of your inheritance will now go to charity. You'll receive enough to live comfortably, but you'll never again have the kind of wealth that allows you to treat people as disposable. The financial blow was staggering, but it wasn't what broke Marcus's composure. It was seeing his mother's tears, the first he'd witnessed since his father's funeral 15 years earlier. I failed you, she whispered. I gave you everything except the one thing that mattered most. I never taught you how to be a good man. Marcus left his childhood home that night, understanding that money couldn't buy back dignity, neither his own nor the young woman's he'd tried to steal. The drive back to the city felt like a journey through the ruins of his entire identity. Everything he'd thought defined him, his wealth, his power, his position, had been built on a foundation of sand. Friday morning brought a new kind of reckoning. Marcus arrived at his office to find a crowd gathered outside Pinnacle Industries headquarters. But these weren't protesters or angry customers. They were employees, hundreds of them standing in silent solidarity with their co-workers who had finally found their voice. Patricia met him at the private elevator with a face he'd never seen her wear before. Not the professional mask of an efficient assistant, but the raw honesty of someone who'd finally decided to speak truth to power. They're resigning, Mr. Wellington, she said simply. Not just the executives. Everyone. The cleaning staff, the security guards, the cafeteria workers. People you've never bothered to learn the names of in 15 years. She handed him a single sheet of paper. It was a resignation letter, but not like any corporate document he'd ever seen. It was handwritten, signed by dozens of employees, and it began with words that would haunt him. We refuse to work for someone who sees service as servitude and dignity as weakness. The letter detailed years of casual cruelties, small humiliations, and systematic devaluation of anyone Marcus considered beneath his notice. It painted a picture of a workplace where fear masqueraded as respect and silence was mistaken for loyalty. Reading it was like looking in a mirror that reflected not his face but his soul. "Sir," Patricia said, her voice gentler now, "I've worked for you for 15 years. I've seen you make brilliant business decisions and generous charitable donations, but I've also watched you treat the people who work hardest to make you successful as if they were invisible. That young woman at the diner, she showed more leadership in 30 seconds than you've shown in 30 years. The building emptied that day like a sinking ship, leaving Marcus alone in his penthouse office with nothing but the view of a city that no longer seemed to belong to him. The silence was deafening, broken only by the constant buzz of his phone with calls from lawyers, board members, and reporters seeking comment on his company's mass exodus. But it was a different call that finally penetrated the fog of his self-pity. The voice on the other end was young, female, and achingly familiar. "Mr. Wellington, this is Sarah Chen from Maple Street Diner." Marcus's hand tightened on the phone. He'd seen her name trending on social media, watched her brief interview where she'd spoken about dignity with more wisdom than he'd accumulated in 4 decades of living. The last person he expected to hear from was the woman whose life he'd tried to diminish. "I know you probably don't want to talk to me," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the same steady calm he remembered from that awful morning. "But I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about you." Marcus couldn't speak. The words stuck in his throat like broken glass. "I've been watching the news," Sarah said. "I've seen what's happening to your company, your reputation. And I keep thinking about something my grandmother used to say. She said that sometimes the worst thing that happens to us is also the best thing because it shows us who we really are and who we can choose to become." The line was quiet except for the sound of Marcus's ragged breathing. "I don't know if you're a good man having a bad moment or a bad man having a moment of clarity," Sarah continued, "but I believe everyone deserves a chance to choose who they want to be tomorrow, regardless of who they were yesterday." She paused, and Marcus could hear the background noise of the diner, the same sounds that had surrounded their encounter just days earlier. "There's something I want to show you," Sarah said. "Something I think you need to see. Can you meet me at the diner tomorrow morning, same time as before?" Marcus found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Why would you want to see me again?" Sarah's answer would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. "Because I think you're hurting, Mr. Wellington. And hurt people hurt people. But healed people heal people. Maybe it's time for some healing." The call ended, leaving Marcus alone with a choice that would define not just his future, but his very soul. He could retreat further into his fortress of wealth and privilege, or he could walk back into that diner and face the mirror Sarah was offering him. Saturday morning would bring more than just another encounter between a fallen billionaire and a working-class woman. It would bring a reckoning that neither money nor power could purchase, and a lesson in redemption that would ripple far beyond the cracked vinyl booths of Maple Street Diner. The question wasn't whether Marcus Wellington would show up. The question was whether he'd have the courage to truly see himself when he did. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzling, as if the sky itself was reflecting Marcus Wellington's inner turmoil. He sat in his Bentley outside Maple Street Diner for 20 minutes, watching through rain-streaked windows as the morning rush unfolded. Construction workers in hard hats, office workers clutching travel mugs, regular people living regular lives that he'd spent his entire existence looking down upon. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from crisis management firms, legal advisors, and board members demanding answers he didn't have. Each ring felt like another nail in the coffin of his former life. The Marcus Wellington who had walked out of this diner 5 days ago no longer existed. In his place sat a man stripped of everything he'd thought defined him, facing a reckoning he'd never imagined possible. When he finally pushed through the door, the familiar bell chimed with the same cheerful indifference as before. But everything else had changed. The diner was packed, filled with customers who looked up as he entered. Some recognized him immediately, their conversations pausing mid-sentence. Others simply stared at this well-dressed man who clearly didn't belong in their world. Sarah was behind the counter, her dark hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail, her uniform pressed and clean despite the obvious chaos of a busy morning. When she saw him, she didn't flinch or look away. She simply nodded toward the same corner booth where his world had imploded. Marcus made his way through the crowded diner, feeling every eye on him. The whispers followed in his wake like a trail of smoke. "That's him. The guy from the video. What's he doing back here?" He slid into the booth, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the worn vinyl that had witnessed his spectacular fall from grace. Sarah appeared at his table with a coffee pot and a clean cup. She poured without asking, the same practiced motion he'd watched her perform countless times in the viral video that had destroyed his life. But this time, her hands were steady. Her expression was calm. She was in control of this moment in a way she hadn't been before. "Thank you for coming," she said, settling into the seat across from him. It was her break, Marcus realized, and she was choosing to spend it with the man who had tried to destroy her dignity in front of a room full of strangers. "I wasn't sure I would," Marcus admitted, his voice hoarse from sleepless nights and too many conversations with lawyers. "I wasn't sure I had the right." Sarah studied his face with the same careful attention she'd given difficult customers for 3 years. She was reading him, Marcus realized, the way she'd learned to read everyone who walked through that door. Looking for the signs that would tell her whether this was genuine remorse or just another performance. "Mr. Wellington," she said finally, "do you know why I called you?" Marcus shook his head, afraid to trust his voice. "Because I've been where you are now," Sarah said quietly. "Not the wealthy part, obviously, but the part where everything you thought you knew about yourself turns out to be wrong, where you have to decide whether you're going to let that destroy you or transform you." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. It showed a younger Sarah in scrubs, standing beside a hospital bed where a thin teenage boy was smiling despite the tubes and wires surrounding him. The boy had Sarah's eyes and her determined chin. "That's my brother Danny," she said, sliding the photo across the table. "He was diagnosed with leukemia 3 years ago. That's when I dropped out of nursing school to work here. The insurance covered some of his treatments, but not nearly enough. I've been working double shifts ever since, trying to keep up with the medical bills." Marcus looked at the photo, then up at Sarah's face. There was no self-pity there, no plea for sympathy. Just the quiet strength of someone who had faced impossible choices and found a way forward. "I tell you this," Sarah continued, "because I want you to understand something. When you stood over me in this booth and told me I was exactly where I belonged, you were right. I am exactly where I belong, but not for the reasons you thought." She leaned forward, her voice gaining intensity without losing its calm. "I belong here because this is where I learned that dignity isn't about what you do for a living. It's about how you treat people when you think nobody's watching. I belong here because this job taught me that real strength isn't about having power over others. It's about lifting others up when they're down." Marcus felt tears he hadn't shed since childhood burning behind his eyes. "Sarah, I'm not done," she said gently but firmly. "I belong here because this place taught me that worth isn't measured by the size of your bank account. It's measured by the size of your heart. And Mr. Wellington, I think your heart is bigger than you've been allowing yourself to believe." She pulled out her phone and showed him something that made his breath catch. It was a GoFundMe page titled Danny Chen's Medical Fund, with a photo of her brother and a description of his ongoing battle with cancer. The fundraising goal was $50,000. The amount raised was over $200,000. "People saw our story in the news," Sarah explained. They learned about Danny's treatments, about why I work here. And they responded with a kind of generosity I never could have imagined. Strangers from around the world sending money to help a family they'd never meet. Marcus stared at the screen, watching the donations scroll by. $5 from a teacher in Ohio, 25 from a retiree in Florida, 100 from a small business owner in California. Hundreds of small acts of kindness from people who had barely enough themselves but chose to give anyway. But here's the thing that might surprise you, Sarah said, taking her phone back. Some of the biggest donations came from people who work at your company. Your former assistant Patricia gave $500. Your head of security donated $1,000. People you never bothered to really see have been taking care of my family while you weren't looking. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He thought about Patricia, who had worked beside him for 15 years, whose children's names he'd never learned. He thought about the security guards who had protected his building, the custodial staff who had cleaned his office, the cafeteria workers who had prepared his meals, people whose names he'd never asked, whose stories he'd never heard. They're good people, Mr. Wellington, Sarah continued, all of them. They always were. The question is, are you? Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out broken and raw. I don't know anymore. I thought I was. I convinced myself that success meant I was a good person, that having money meant I was valuable. But watching that video, seeing myself through everyone else's eyes, he stopped, overwhelmed by the weight of his own recognition. I was a monster, he whispered. I was cruel to you, to them, to everyone who couldn't fight back. And the worst part is, I thought I was justified. I thought being successful gave me the right to treat people like they were disposable. Sarah reached across the table and did something that shocked them both. She placed her hand over his, the same gentle gesture she might offer to any customer who was hurting. Mr. Wellington, she said softly, you're not a monster. You're a person who lost his way. There's a difference, and that difference matters. She withdrew her hand and leaned back, her expression thoughtful. I've been watching the news coverage of what's happened to you. I've seen the business deals falling apart, the employees leaving, your family distancing themselves, and I keep thinking about something my grandmother used to say. She said that sometimes God has to strip everything away from us before we can see what really matters. Marcus looked around the diner, taking in details he'd missed during his previous visit. The way the cook smiled when he handed out plates, the gentle way an elderly waitress helped a customer with trembling hands read the menu, the community board by the door covered with photos of local families, job postings, and thank you notes from satisfied customers. This place, he said slowly, it's not just a restaurant, is it? Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile she'd given him. No, it's not. It's a community. It's a place where people take care of each other, where the cook makes soup for sick customers and doesn't charge them, where we keep a jar by the register so people can donate their change to help families in need, where everyone matters regardless of how much money they have. She gestured toward a corner booth where an elderly man sat alone, slowly working his way through a cup of coffee and a piece of pie. That's Mr. Rodriguez, she said quietly. His wife died last year and he comes in every morning because he doesn't want to drink his coffee alone. We never rush him, never make him feel like he's taking up space, because this is his place too. Marcus watched the old man, seeing something in his solitude that resonated with his own isolation. I've been drinking my coffee alone for years, he realized aloud, even when I was surrounded by people. Money can buy you a lot of things, Sarah said, but it can't buy you connection. It can't buy you purpose. It can't buy you the feeling that you matter to someone else's life in a meaningful way. She stood up, her break clearly coming to an end. But before she could leave, Marcus reached out, not quite touching her arm, but making a gesture that stopped her. Sarah, he said, his voice thick with emotion he'd suppressed for decades. I want to make this right, not just with you, but with everyone. I want to learn how to be the kind of person who builds community instead of destroying it. Will you help me? Sarah looked down at him. This broken man who had lost everything but might finally be ready to find himself. Her answer would determine not just his future, but the futures of countless people whose lives had been touched by his cruelty, or could be transformed by his redemption. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her response. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean and preparing it for whatever would come next. I'll help you, Sarah said quietly, but not in the way you might think. She sat back down, her expression serious but not unkind. You can't buy your way out of this, Mr. Wellington. You can't write a check and make it disappear. Real change, the kind that matters, starts from the inside out. Marcus nodded, understanding for the first time that money wouldn't solve this problem. What do I need to do? Sarah glanced around the bustling diner, then back at him. You need to understand what service actually means. Not the kind where people bow and scrape because you're paying them. Real service. The kind that comes from caring about someone else's well-being more than your own comfort. She pulled a small notebook from her apron and wrote something down, tearing off the page and sliding it across to him. It was an address he didn't recognize, along with a time, 6 a.m. Monday. That's the address of the community kitchen where I volunteer on weekends, she explained. They serve breakfast to homeless families, people who are between jobs, seniors on fixed incomes. Anyone who needs a hot meal and doesn't ask questions about why. Marcus stared at the address, his mind racing. You want me to volunteer there? I want you to learn what it means to serve people who can't do anything for you in return, Sarah said firmly. No cameras, no publicity, no tax write-offs. Just you, an apron, and people who need help. People whose names you'll learn, whose stories you'll hear, whose humanity you'll have to acknowledge. The idea terrified him more than any hostile takeover or board meeting ever had. I don't know how to do that kind of work. Neither did I when I started, Sarah replied. But Maria, the woman who runs the kitchen, she'll teach you. Just like she taught me that dignity isn't something you lose when you need help. It's something you give to others when they need it most. Marcus folded the paper carefully and put it in his wallet, next to business cards that no longer held any meaning. And after that, 6 months later, Marcus Wellington stood in the community kitchen at 5:30 a.m., tying an apron around his waist with hands that had learned the rhythm of honest work. His expensive suits had been replaced by simple clothing that could withstand the splashes of soup and the embrace of grateful strangers. He knew the names now. Mrs. Rodriguez, who came for breakfast every Tuesday after visiting her husband's grave. Tommy, the veteran whose smile could light up the darkest morning. Little Amy, whose drawings covered the kitchen's bulletin board like rays of sunshine. Sarah watched from across the room as Marcus carefully ladled oatmeal into bowls, his movements precise not from arrogance, but from care. The man who had once sneered at coffee in a diner now served breakfast with the kind of attention that came from understanding that every person who walked through those doors carried a story worth honoring. The viral video was still there, still circulating, still reminding the world of who Marcus Wellington had been. But something new was growing alongside it. Stories of transformation, reports of a former CEO who had traded his corner office for a soup kitchen. Articles about genuine change that couldn't be bought or manufactured. This story reminds us that our worst moments don't have to define us, but they can transform us if we have the courage to truly see ourselves. Sometimes the greatest gift we can receive is the mirror of our own failures, held up by someone with the grace to believe we can become better. True wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch, the dignity we preserve, and the love we choose to show when no one is watching.